We'll start off by opening the program. The first thing we'll see is a window asking us if we want to use 3D Max in Classic mode or Design mode. We'll choose Classic mode. The next thing we'll see is this window, where we'll find the templates and recent files. On this side we have the most recent files you used, and here you can select the templates you want for 3D Max. We're going to use the original, and in case we didn't want this window to open again, we would deactivate this option and close. And this shouldn't appear again. If we had chosen Design mode instead of Classic mode, we could change the interface of 3D Max and customize Custom UI Default Switcher. In this window, you can choose the layout you want. So in this case, we'll use 3D Max Classic. The first thing we have here is the interface, which, as you can see, is not very complex. It has the typical tabs on top like any other program: Modify, Create, Animation, Graph Editors, Render, etc. We see all of this later on. The next thing we have is this icon bar here. That includes tools that we can use to model. First, we have Do and Undo, linking options, selection tools. Here we have the transformations: select and move, rotate, scale. On this side are the snaps that we'll also take a look at later on. Finally, here are some other options like align, mirror, layers, animation curves, and different render options. The next thing I want to show you is this panel on the right. This is a very important tools panel. We have a Create panel, Modify panel, Hierarchy, Motion, Display, and Utility. If you leave the cursor over, see how each layer is named. On this course, we're going to work with the first three, as the last three are used mainly for specific things that aren't really relevant to us on this course. In the first tab is the Create panel. Here is where we find all our objects, like a box, a sphere, whatever we make. We then have this window here where the standard primitives are: the extended primitives, compound objects, particles, windows, and other things that we can use. In this subpanel, we have the splines, which would be the lines, the lights, cameras, helpers, etc. Although we'll see all of this as we go along. In the next tab, which is Modify, we can edit each sub-object we have. So in this case, modify the properties of the box, etc. Finally, we have the third option, which is the Hierarchy. That affects the pivots of each object. We can have it affect only our pivots and move it. We can center it, align it, reset it, etc. We'll also see this in more detail later on. Lastly, down here, we have the Timeline, where we can create animations with frames. These are the key frames, and there are also other functions that we'll explore, like the zoom, angles, etc. In the case we had a window that had disappeared, we can always go to this option here and reset the default layout of our interface. Here are our 4 views. We can select them by just clicking on them. Before that, we press plus and then configure viewports. We'll focus on this layer here, which is the Layouts layer. In Layouts, we want to change the template, so to speak, of our viewports to make it more comfortable to work. It's a good idea to work with the 4 views open. It's easier to edit from the perspective that's most convenient. So for now, I leave the 4. Another tip is, as you see when you move the cursor over the corner of the views, the cursor changes, and this allows us to modify them easily. The next thing we'll see are the options we have inside the viewports. As you can see, there are 4 sub-windows. In the first is the plus, small commands that maximize the ports, activate it, deactivate it, show or hide the mesh, and other settings that we'll see when we need them. The next step is the perspective, where we can select the perspective we want. If we want top, bottom, front, or where we can select a view to see it through a camera or a light. The third one is the definition of the viewport, to give it a name. So we have default shading selected by default, but we could show the faces as you see on the sphere. We could do it with flat colors. We could do it with clay and other materials that help to visualize our model. In Stylize, there are other options like graffito. Usually, we would work in default shading, which is quite comfortable and gives us a good idea of what our final model will look like. We'll use these visualization tools quite often, and the fastest way to access them is F3 and F4. With F4, you show and hide the wireframe, and F3 shows and hides what is the solid of our model. So you can switch between them as you go along. The next thing we'll see are some commands to move between the viewports. We'll use the central button on the mouse quite a lot. To start with, Alt-W maximizes the viewport. Or you have this option here, Maximize Viewport. With Alt-W, you can maximize and minimize as you need. If you hold down the middle button or the scroll wheel on the mouse, you can pan the scene and move sideways. When you use the same button and press Alt, you can rotate. If you scroll up or down, you can zoom in and out. And in case we were working on the scene and we get lost and we didn't know where our model was, by pressing Z, we'd go back to the scene. Also, when using, for example, Alt and the scroll wheel to rotate, when an object is selected, our camera will use that object as a reference, which basically rotates around the object. If we didn't have an object selected, we just rotate around the general scene.